I used to work the graveyard shift at a small 24-hour diner off the highway, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills, and it had that quiet, isolated atmosphere that allowed me to just get through the night. Most of the regulars were truckers or night owls who'd come for a cup of coffee and maybe a slice of pie, not really looking to have a conversation. But there was one thing about that diner, one thing I didn't expect. And that was what happened to me one night during my shift. It was a cold, misty night in early October. The kind of night where the fog rolls in thick and the headlights of passing cars seem to vanish into the gloom. I was alone, as usual, just finishing cleaning up a table in the corner when I heard the bell above the door jingle. I glanced up, expecting a late-night customer, but no one was there. At first, I thought it was the wind. Maybe the door had opened slightly, but then I heard it. A soft, low voice, barely a whisper, from somewhere in the back. "Help. Me." I froze. It wasn't the voice of a customer. It was more like a rasping, strained sound. I looked around the diner, expecting to see someone, but the place was empty. The light from the neon sign outside cast a red glow over the room, making everything seem even more eerie than usual. My breath caught in my throat as I cautiously made my way to the back of the diner, to the kitchen. There was no one there. I checked the bathrooms, the storage closet, and even the freezer, but the place was empty. My heart started to race, and my thoughts began to swirl. I'm just imagining things, I told myself. Maybe it's just the isolation getting to me, or maybe I'm just tired from the long shifts. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I went back to the counter, wiped my hands on my apron, and tried to focus on the clock ticking above me. That's when I heard it again. Louder this time. "Help me." It was unmistakable now, coming from the far side of the diner, near the back exit. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind again, or maybe the old plumbing, but I knew that wasn't it. I slowly walked toward the back door, which led out to the parking lot. The dim, flickering light from the diner illuminated the ground, and there, lying on the ground near the door, was an old, weathered-looking photograph. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling slightly. It was a black and white photo of a group of people standing in front of the diner. I could barely make out their faces, but what struck me was the date written on the bottom, 1953. I flipped the photo over, and that's when I saw the words scribbled in pencil on the back. "We will never leave. We will never rest." I felt a chill run down my spine. I stared at the photograph, my mind racing. What did this mean, and why was this here in the exact spot where I had heard the strange voice? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the bell jingling again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I rushed to the door and peered outside, but there was no one in the parking lot. It was dead silent, except for the faint rustling of the trees in the distance. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my brain. Maybe I was just losing it. Maybe I was overthinking everything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to take a break, get some fresh air, and clear my head. I stepped outside into the cold night and walked toward the back of the diner, toward the old cemetery that sat behind it. It was an abandoned cemetery, long forgotten by the town, the gravestones weathered and cracked from years of neglect. I had always thought it was a little creepy back there, but I never paid it much attention. That night, something felt different. I walked through the cemetery, the fog thickening as I made my way between the gravestones. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the strangest feeling, like I wasn't alone. I glanced over my shoulder, but all I saw was the thick mist swirling around me. That's when I heard it again. The voice. This time, it was louder, more desperate. "Help me." I froze in place, my blood running cold. The voice seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby, somewhere close. I glanced down at the ground and my heart nearly stopped. There, in the damp earth, was an old rotting coffin half buried. It looked like it had been disturbed, the lid cracked open just enough to reveal something inside. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know what was in that coffin, but I couldn't help it. I walked over to it, the fog pressing in around me, and looked inside. There, lying in the coffin, was a skeletal figure. Its face was almost unrecognizable, but its eyes were wide open, staring at me. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The bones were all that remained of whatever had once been a person, but the eyes, they were still alive. Still watching, I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the voice spoke again, louder this time. Get out! Now! I turned and ran, not caring about the chill in the air, the fog, or the old cemetery behind me. I ran all the way back to the diner, bursting through the back door, gasping for breath. I didn't even stop to lock it. I just stumbled inside and slammed the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, my hands shaking. That's when I noticed something even more terrifying. The photograph. It was gone. I searched the diner, frantically looking for it, but it was nowhere to be found. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. The photograph, the voice, the cemetery, the eyes in the coffin. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't piece it all together. And then in the silence of the diner, I heard it again. The voice. This time it was not from outside. It was right behind me, whispering in my ear. Help me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, except for the faint glow of the neon sign outside. My stomach churned as I backed away, my eyes darting around, desperately searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But then I saw it, a shadow moving in the corner of my eye. I turned, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway, its face obscured by the darkness. The figure stepped forward, and for a moment I thought I would faint from fear. It was the same figure from the photograph, the one from the old cemetery. It was wearing the same clothes, the same expression frozen in time. But there was something wrong with it. The eyes, they were empty, hollow. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The figure reached out a hand, and I backed away, my legs trembling, but I was too slow. The cold fingers touched my shoulder, and I felt an icy chill run through me. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I didn't stay around to find out what happened next. I grabbed my coat, ran out the front door, and never looked back. I never returned to that diner, not even once. I moved out of town soon after, but the nightmares, they never stopped. Every night, I can still hear the voice whispering, calling me, help me. And I know, deep down, that whatever it was, it will never let me go.
Next story.
I've worked the graveyard shift for nearly 2 years now. There's something eerie about that time of night, something that makes the shadows feel alive. But nothing could prepare me for what happened on my last shift, and honestly, I don't know if I'll ever be the same. I was working at an old 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of town, surrounded by nothing but dense woods and the occasional passing car. The place had been open since the 60s, and it still had that same dusty, dated feel about it. The floors were scuffed and the fluorescent lights buzzed in that unnatural way, flickering when the wind hit the old windows. I was used to the silence, the solitude. But that night, it felt different. The wind howled outside and the rain pounded the roof in torrents. I knew it was going to be a long, lonely shift, but I didn't mind. It wasn't until about 2:30 a.m. that things started to take a turn. I was sitting behind the counter, flipping through an old magazine, when the bell above the door rang. I glanced up, expecting to see the usual late-night customer, a trucker grabbing coffee or a late-night driver needing to fill up, but no one was there. I shook my head and chalked it up to the wind or my tired eyes playing tricks on me. I got up and walked to the door to check. The parking lot was empty, the only movement coming from the branches of the trees swaying in the wind. I stepped back inside, feeling a chill run down my spine. I tried to shrug it off, but the sensation wouldn't leave. I sat back down, my gaze scanning the dark, empty station. That's when I heard it, a soft thumping noise, almost like footsteps. I froze. The thumping wasn't coming from outside, but from somewhere inside the building. My eyes darted to the back room, but the door was shut tight. The only other place someone could be was the bathroom, and I hadn't seen anyone come in. I told myself it was just the wind again, or maybe some animal outside. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. My skin tingled, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stood and walked cautiously toward the bathroom door, my heart racing with every step. The thumping had stopped, but now there was a faint scratching sound, like something, or someone, was dragging something heavy across the floor. I don't know what made me open the door. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the need to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But when I did, I wish I hadn't. The bathroom was empty, but the air felt cold, like it had been refrigerated. The mirror above the sink was fogged up, though there was no steam in the air. I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of the fog. That's when I saw it. In the mist, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of a face with hollow, dark eyes and a twisted grin. I jumped back, my breath catching in my throat. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. I turned around to leave, but something stopped me. I felt eyes on me, cold, piercing eyes. I slowly turned, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty. But the air wasn't. It was as if someone was standing just out of sight, watching me, breathing down my neck. I ran back to the counter, my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something or someone was lurking just out of my line of sight. The bell above the door rang again. I spun around, almost certain I'd see someone. But once again, there was nothing. The parking lot was still empty. I quickly scanned the dimly lit gas station, my breath coming in short bursts. Then I saw it. Just outside the glass door, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure standing motionless, staring directly at me. I could barely make out the outline, a tall, thin shape that seemed to blend into the shadows. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to go anywhere near that thing. But I had to. I had to know what it was. I grabbed my coat and slowly made my way toward the door, trying to ignore the icy chill creeping up my spine. The figure remained motionless, its eyes fixed on me as I approached. My hands shook as I reached for the door handle. That's when I heard the whisper. It was soft, almost imperceptible at first, like a voice on the wind. But then it grew clearer, more distinct. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze. My body screamed at me to turn around, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Slowly, I turned the handle and opened the door just enough to peer outside. There, standing at the edge of the parking lot, was the figure. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its eyes, those cold, soulless eyes, burning into me. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered again, this time from behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The store was completely empty. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. It was like the air had thickened, suffocating me, holding me in place. The lights flickered again, and the whispering grew louder, more frantic. It was everywhere now, all around me, like a chorus of voices chanting in a language I couldn't understand. "You shouldn't have come." Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further. The cold wrapped around me like an invisible hand, and the whispers grew into a cacophony of unintelligible noise. My legs gave way, and I fell to the floor, trembling uncontrollably. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew I was no longer alone. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something was coming from the back room. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. A shadow, tall and formless, was sliding out from the darkness, its eyes glowing like embers in the night. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, like it wasn't bound by the same laws of physics as anything else. It stopped in front of me, towering over me. The whispering ceased, and in the silence, I heard a voice, clear as day, right next to my ear. "You should never have worked the graveyard shift." I couldn't breathe. The voice was chilling, like ice was running through my veins. My vision blurred, and I felt myself slipping into unconsciousness. Just as I thought I would pass out, the voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. "Leave. Now." I scrambled to my feet, panic flooding my body. The shadow retreated into the back room, and I bolted for the door. I didn't even look back. I ran out into the rain, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, slamming the door behind me. I didn't return to the gas station after that night. The next morning, when I told my manager what had happened, he just looked at me with that familiar, knowing expression. He'd worked there for years, but I could see the unease in his eyes. He told me the station had a history. He said people had vanished before, without a trace, always at night. It was a running joke among the staff, but I knew something was wrong. I knew that whatever was haunting that place wasn't something you could just laugh off. I've never worked another graveyard shift, and I never will. Some things are better left alone, hidden in the dark. If you ever find yourself near that gas station, don't stop. Just keep driving, no matter how empty the road seems, because something is waiting for you out there in the dark. Something that only comes out when the clock strikes midnight, and it's hungry.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts, at least not until that night. I used to think the stories were just that, stories. People telling tales to spook each other around campfires or during Halloween. But after what happened to me, I know better. I've seen it, felt it, and now I'm afraid of the dark and the silence that follows it. I had just started working the graveyard shift at an old, dilapidated convenience store on the edge of town. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills, and the place was practically empty most nights. Quiet, peaceful, even. Or at least that's what I thought. The store had been around for decades. The walls were stained with years of nicotine, and the floor creaked with every step. I always told myself the building had character, but the truth was, it felt like it was holding something back, something dark. I was assigned to work alone most nights. The manager, a gruff guy named Ted, would leave after the evening shift, leaving me to lock up until morning. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. It wasn't like a random glance from a customer. It was more intense, as if someone was right behind me, breathing down my neck. But when I turned around, there was nothing. It was around 2 a.m. when it first happened. I remember it so clearly. The night was quiet, too quiet. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside the store, everything was still. I was zoning out, flipping through a magazine behind the counter when the doorbell jingled. I glanced up and there was no one there. At first I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe it was the wind or a car passing by that caused the door to move slightly. But then I heard it again. The bell. I stood up, my heart racing, looking out into the dark parking lot. Nothing. No car. No people. Just the empty stretch of asphalt that led into the woods. I hesitated, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I checked the security monitors, but they were as empty as the store. So I shrugged it off and went back to my post. But that's when it started getting weird. A few minutes later, I heard it again. The bell. But this time it was followed by a soft scraping sound, like something or someone was dragging their feet across the floor. I turned quickly, scanning the aisles, but once again, I was alone. My mind was racing. Was it an animal? Was someone messing with me? I don't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then the temperature dropped. I'm talking about a sudden, unexplainable drop. It felt like someone had opened a freezer door right next to me. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I shivered involuntarily. It was like the store had been submerged into a pocket of cold air that shouldn't have existed. I decided it was time to check the back room. Maybe the furnace had gone out or something was malfunctioning. As I walked toward the hallway leading to the back, I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. But when I spun around, nothing. My nerves were on edge as I entered the back room, flicking on the light. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs above me was the only sound, but then, just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard a whisper. Soft, like a voice just beyond the edge of hearing. "Help me." I froze. My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from behind me, or even from inside the room. It felt like it was coming from everywhere. I turned quickly, almost tripping over my own feet in the rush. The lights flickered and the whisper came again, closer this time. "Help me." I ran back to the front of the store, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt like I was in danger. I checked the front door again. Locked. The cameras were still showing empty aisles. Everything seemed normal, except it wasn't. Then it happened. The shelves began to rattle violently. I looked up just in time to see a bottle of soda fly off the top shelf and crash onto the floor. The store was shaking now, the lights flickering with every movement. The whispers grew louder, louder, as if the voices were surrounding me, echoing through the walls. "Help me. Help me." My mind was racing. I didn't know if I was losing it or if something truly supernatural was happening, but I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, dialed Ted's number, and waited with trembling hands. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then an eerie silence. I hung up. Then the doorbell rang again. But this time, the sound was no longer just a bell. It was a shrill, distorted chime, as if the bell itself was being manipulated by an unseen force. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the counter, nearly tripping over my own feet. The lights above me went out, plunging the store into darkness. I could hear the whispers again, but they were no longer soft. They were frantic, desperate. "Help me!" I stumbled toward the exit, my hands shaking so much I could barely turn the key in the door. But when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The door wouldn't move. I pushed and pulled, but it felt like it was sealed shut from the other side. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath hanging in front of me in icy clouds. My entire body was shaking, not from cold, but from fear. Then I heard something that froze me in my tracks. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. Slowly they drew closer, coming from the back of the store. I turned toward the sound, my blood turning to ice as I saw something moving in the darkness. A figure, pale and gaunt, its face obscured by shadows. The figure didn't walk. It floated. Its feet didn't touch the ground, and as it moved, I could feel the air grow even colder. The whispers were louder now, all around me. I couldn't understand them, but they were suffocating, closing in on me. I couldn't take it. I screamed, pulling at the door with every ounce of strength I had. And then, just as the figure reached the counter, the door burst open with a force that sent me sprawling onto the ground. I don't remember how I got out of there. I don't remember how I managed to run. All I know is that I didn't stop running until I was outside. And even then, the whispers followed me. Faint at first, then louder, growing into a maddening cacophony that only seemed to fade when I was a few blocks away. The next day, I returned to work. It was the same routine, the same shift. But when I walked into the store, I knew it wasn't the same. The air felt heavy. The lights buzzed overhead in a way that made my skin crawl. And when I walked past the back room, I couldn't help but notice something I hadn't before. A small, dusty photograph on the wall tucked away behind an old coat rack. The picture was of a man who looked eerily familiar. And on the back of the photo, written in faded ink, was a single word, help. I never went back after that. I couldn't. I don't know who or what that thing was, but I know it's still there, waiting. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can hear the whispers again. Help me. And no matter how many lights I turn on or doors I lock, I still feel it. The cold, the footsteps, the fear, it's always there.
Next story.
I'd always been a skeptic when it came to ghosts. Raised in a small town, I'd heard the stories, old legends passed down by locals, ghost sightings in the woods, strange occurrences at the old house on Elm Street, but I never believed any of it. I chalked it up to the imagination of bored minds looking for something to believe in. That is, until I worked my first shift at the old gas station on the outskirts of town. I was new to the job, and the place had a reputation. It wasn't the most well-kept station. The paint was peeling, the sign flickered, and the store inside was dimly lit with flickering fluorescent lights. But it was quiet, and in a town like ours, that was a blessing. It wasn't until my first week that I started to feel the unease that the other employees spoke about. I was working the midnight to 6 a.m. shift, which, as you can imagine, was mostly quiet. There was the occasional car that would pull in for gas, and maybe a few customers needing snacks or drinks, but for the most part, the place was empty. Most nights, I'd sit behind the counter, scrolling on my phone, watching the clock tick slowly toward the end of my shift. On the third night, I noticed something strange. It started off small, almost imperceptible. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or the shadows playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again. Movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing by the window just beyond the reach of the lights. It was tall and thin, cloaked in shadow, but it was there, watching me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. But when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as exhaustion playing tricks on me. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. But then the noises started, soft, almost inaudible at first, a gentle tapping on the window. I assumed it was just the wind or maybe a bird, but when I stepped closer to inspect, there was nothing. No birds, no breeze, just the eerie stillness of the night. It happened again the next night, and the next. Each time the figure would appear at the window standing motionless as though waiting, and each time I would go to check and it would vanish. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I started to feel nervous, unsettled, like I wasn't alone, but every logical part of my brain told me there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was some prankster, a local kid trying to scare me. But the oddest part? No one ever came inside to pay for gas or snacks during these encounters. It was as if the place was empty, save for me and the figure outside. One particularly cold night, as the wind howled and the snow began to fall heavily outside, I was sitting at the counter, trying to pass the time when I saw it again. But this time, the figure wasn't standing in the usual spot by the window. No, it was standing by the door, right in front of the glass, staring at me through the fogged-up surface. My blood ran cold. I knew I couldn't be imagining it this time. I walked cautiously toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. The bell above the door jingled faintly as I opened it, and the cold air hit me like a slap in the face. There was nothing. No figure. No sign of anyone. I stepped outside, scanning the area, my breath coming out in puffs of steam as the wind whipped through the trees. There was no one in sight, no car in the lot. I quickly closed the door behind me, unsure of what to do. I tried to rationalize it again, but the fear kept gnawing at the back of my mind. That's when I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, coming from the far side of the gas station. It was a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Help. Help me. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The voice seemed to echo from the woods behind the station. A chill ran through me, and I stepped backward, unsure of what to do. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it was clear and unsettling. Hello? I called, my voice shaky, but the only response was the wind howling in the distance. Then the door swung open behind me. I spun around, heart racing. But again, there was no one there. The store was empty, as it had been for hours. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept seeing glimpses of shadows, hearing the whispers, but when I looked, there was never anything there. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just tired, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. And that's when I found the old journal. It was in the back storage closet, tucked in between some dusty boxes of old supplies. It looked ancient, the leather cover cracked and worn, but it had an odd feeling to it, like it didn't belong there. The moment I opened it, I could feel my hands shake. The journal was filled with strange, cryptic entries. There were names, some crossed out, and dates that seemed to go back decades. The entries were fragmented, but one thing stood out. One sentence that was written repeatedly. I never left. I'm still here. I felt sick to my stomach as I read those words. It didn't make any sense. Who had written this? Why was it here? And why did it feel like someone was watching me? That's when I heard it again. The voice, faint but unmistakable. Help. Help me. I slammed the journal shut, the sound of it echoing in the empty store. My hands were trembling and I felt the weight of the room close in around me. I needed to leave, but the door was locked. The key was gone. The bell above the door rang, but there was no customer. I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel it, that presence, something lingering in the shadows just beyond the walls, watching me. I could hear the faint whispers now, louder than before, more urgent. I had to get out. I had to escape. I searched frantically for the keys, my mind racing, but every time I looked around, the shadows seemed to shift. The whispers grew louder, and then I saw it. The figure standing by the counter, no longer at the window. Its face was pale, almost translucent, its eyes wide open and dark, hollow. Help me, it whispered again. I turned and ran. I ran straight for the back door, desperate to get out. But as I reached for the handle, I saw the reflection in the window. It wasn't just one figure anymore. There were more. Dozens. All standing there watching me with those empty, lifeless eyes. I screamed, yanked the door open, and bolted into the night, never looking back. The snow was falling heavily now, but I didn't care. I ran all the way back to my car and drove straight to the nearest police station. They found the old gas station the next morning. It had burned down years ago. No one had worked there for decades, and the property had been abandoned. But as I stood in that police station, I swore I could still hear it, the faint whisper of voices calling from the distance. Help me. They were still waiting, still trapped, and I knew they would never let me forget it.
Next story.
It was a hot summer night, and I was working the graveyard shift at the small, out-of-the-way motel on the edge of town. The kind of place where the walls were thin, the lights flickered, and the air always smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. I hadn't been working there long, just a few weeks, but already the odd things happening every night had begun to get under my skin. I remember that night as though it was yesterday. It started like any other. I was sitting behind the counter, scrolling through my phone, waiting for the clock to finally hit 6 a.m. so I could go home. It was the same routine, no customers, no phone calls, just silence. But then the door opened. The bell above it jingled, and I looked up, startled out of my daze. A man walked in, tall and thin, his face pale as if he hadn't seen the sun in years. He wore a long, dark coat despite the heat, and his eyes were fixed on the floor as he shuffled towards the counter. I didn't know why, but something about him unsettled me immediately. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound as friendly as possible. He didn't answer at first. He just stood there, staring at the floor as if lost in thought. The silence stretched on longer than I was comfortable with. I cleared my throat. "I need a room," he finally muttered, his voice low and raspy. I nodded, grabbing the key to one of the vacant rooms. I wasn't one to judge, but something about him felt off. Still, he was paying guests, so I handed him the room key and gave him directions to the door. He didn't say anything else. He just turned and walked away. For the next few hours, I sat at the counter, reading and trying to distract myself. But every now and then, I'd glance out the front window, half expecting to see the man walking around outside or standing near his room. But each time, the area was still, nothing but the flickering neon sign and the quiet hum of the fan. Around 3 a.m., I decided to take a walk around the motel. It was an old building, and I'd noticed some strange creaks and groans from the walls at night. I figured I'd check the rooms, make sure everything was okay. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside. I walked past the rooms, shining my light inside. The first few were empty, but when I reached the man's room, I felt a chill run down my spine. The door was ajar, not wide open, just slightly cracked, as if someone had left it that way. I knocked gently, not wanting to intrude, but feeling like I should make sure everything was all right. "Hello?" I called softly. "Sir, everything okay in there?" There was no answer, but I noticed the light was on, faintly glowing from under the door. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed the door open slightly. The room was empty. The bed was made neatly, and the curtains were drawn tight, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. A piece of paper, folded neatly, was sitting on the desk near the window. I picked it up and opened it, half expecting some sort of note or letter. But all that was written on it were the words, "They're still here." I couldn't explain it. I didn't know who they were, but something about it made my skin crawl. I dropped the paper back onto the desk and quickly closed the door behind me. The rest of the night passed without incident, and when morning finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. I locked up the office and went home, trying to forget the strange events of the night. But it didn't end there. A few days later, the man returned. I wasn't working the night shift that time, but the other receptionist told me about it the next day. He'd checked in again, the same dark coat, the same pale face. She said he had seemed agitated, like he was in a hurry, but he hadn't said much. That night, as I was walking past the man's room on my shift, I saw the door open slightly again. I froze. The same strange feeling washed over me. Something wasn't right. I knocked on the door again, this time with more urgency. "Sir, are you in there?" No response. I opened the door, more cautiously this time. And there he was, but he wasn't the same. His skin was even paler, his eyes wide and wild as if he hadn't slept in days. He was standing in the corner of the room facing the wall. His body was stiff, unnaturally still. "Sir?" I asked, stepping into the room. "Are you okay?" Without turning around, he mumbled, "They're here." I felt a sudden chill sweep over me, as if the air itself had changed. It was almost suffocating, thick with something I couldn't explain. Then the lights flickered, once, twice, and then went out completely. I heard a sound, something faint but unmistakable, a low, rhythmic thudding, like footsteps dragging across the floor. I swung my flashlight around the room, but it was empty, except for the man still standing in the corner. I grabbed his arm, trying to turn him toward me, but the moment I touched him, he let out a sound, a low, gurgling scream that made my blood run cold. His body twitched violently, and I pulled my hand away, stumbling backward. His head snapped toward me, and I froze in terror. His eyes weren't human anymore. They were dark, hollow, like two black voids staring straight through me. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered. Before I could react, the lights flickered back on, and he collapsed to the ground in a heap. I backed away in a daze, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I couldn't explain what had just happened. My hands were shaking as I reached for the phone to call for help, but when I looked back at the man, he was gone. The room was empty once again, as if he had never been there. I didn't stay to figure it out. I couldn't. I grabbed my things and left. terrified, my mind racing. The strange events only intensified in the following days, with guests complaining of noises, flickering lights, and other bizarre occurrences. And yet, whenever the man came to check in, no one else ever saw him. After I quit the job, I found out the truth from an old employee who had been there longer than anyone. The motel had been built on land that had once been a cemetery. The previous owner had tried to cover up the strange happenings, but guests had been known to disappear over the years. The man in the dark coat, he was one of them. A soul trapped between worlds, still waiting for someone to help him. And I had unwittingly stepped into a nightmare I could never escape.
Next story.
I used to think that the scariest thing about the graveyard shift was the silence. Working alone in a small 24-hour convenience store in a rundown part of town, you learn to live with the oppressive quiet. No customers, just the occasional passing car and the soft hum of the refrigerators and fluorescent lights. It wasn't exactly thrilling, but it paid the bills. Little did I know, my quiet nights would soon be shattered by something far worse than silence. It was just past midnight when the first strange thing happened. I was behind the counter, scrolling through my phone, when the doorbell above the entrance chimed. The bell was old and rusty, and it always sounded like a dying gasp. I glanced up, expecting to see a late-night customer, maybe a trucker or someone grabbing snacks after a long shift. But there was no one there. I frowned. I had definitely heard the bell. It wasn't the wind. There were no drafts. Slowly, I stood up and moved toward the door, my footsteps echoing in the empty store. The parking lot was empty, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. I checked the street again. Nothing. I shook my head and laughed nervously to myself. Guess I'm just losing it. I turned back to the counter, but just as I was about to sit down, I heard it again. The bell rang, this time much louder, almost like someone was standing directly outside the door. I froze. Something didn't feel right. I went to the door again, peered outside, but there was no one. My heart was starting to pound in my chest now. The silence was suffocating, but there was a strange tension in the air, like something was watching me. I stood there for a while, trying to calm myself, but the feeling didn't go away. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. I wasn't alone in the store, after all. There were cameras everywhere. If anyone were to show up, I'd see them. With a sigh, I returned to the counter, trying to push the strange sensation out of my mind. But then the power flickered. The lights dimmed for just a second, but it was enough to make me jump. I stood up, scanning the store, looking for any sign of movement. The store was as still as it had been when I first walked in. I could feel my pulse quicken again, the hairs on my neck standing up. The power flickered again, but this time it didn't come back on. The lights went out completely. For a moment, the darkness was suffocating. My phone screen lit up the space around me just enough to make out the edges of the shelves and the aisles. The hum of the refrigerators was gone. The entire store had fallen into an eerie, unnatural stillness. I felt the panic rising in my chest. I reached for the flashlight behind the counter and clicked it on, but my hands were shaking so badly that it took a few tries before the beam of light finally flickered to life. I called the power company, my voice shaky as I explained the situation, but the response I got wasn't reassuring. The woman on the other end of the line told me that there had been no reported outages in the area. It was a freak occurrence, she said, but nothing to worry about. Just wait for the power to come back, she advised. But as I stood there in the dark, something told me the power wasn't the only thing I should be worried about. I heard something move. It wasn't the wind or the settling of the building. This was a distinct, deliberate sound like footsteps. I snapped the flashlight around, but the beam of light only caught shadows. There was no one there. I swallowed hard. Maybe it was a customer. Maybe they were just messing with me. I was about to call out, but something stopped me. A chill crawled up my spine, and my breath hitched in my throat. I turned slowly, the flashlight's beam sweeping the aisles of the store. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the store. It was tall and cloaked in shadow, its features obscured by the darkness. But there was something wrong about it. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at me, or at least I thought it was. The face wasn't visible, but I could feel its gaze burning into me. I swallowed. my throat dry. I had no idea what to do. Should I call the cops, run for the door? But I couldn't move. My body was frozen, rooted to the spot, and then it stepped forward. It didn't walk the way a person would. It glided, almost as if it were floating above the ground. I could hear the soft shuffle of feet on the linoleum floor, but it didn't make a sound, no footsteps, no creaks. It just moved. The air grew heavier, colder. I could feel my breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure drew closer, and I could see it more clearly now. It was tall, too tall for any human, its body long and twisted. It wore something that looked like a ragged coat or cloak, but it was hard to tell in the dim light. The face was hidden, but the faint glow from my flashlight revealed a pair of eyes. Empty, black voids, like two endless pits that sucked in the light. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The thing stopped right in front of me. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. A sound, like a low growl, rumbled from deep within its chest. I stumbled backward, my hand clutching the counter to steady myself, but it didn't come any closer. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I finally found my voice. "What do you want?" The air around me seemed to grow colder still. The figure didn't respond, but I could feel its intentions. Whatever it wasn't here by accident. It wasn't some lost soul or stray traveler. It was something darker, something ancient. Suddenly the lights flickered again, and this time they came back on, brighter than before, like someone had flipped a switch. The figure was gone. The store was empty. I blinked, disoriented. The power had returned, but the sense of dread hadn't faded. The silence felt even heavier now, as if the air itself were thick with something sinister. I didn't know what I had just seen, or who or what had been in the store with me. I only knew one thing. I wasn't going to find out. The next morning, I quit my job. I never went back. But sometimes when I drive past that old store, I swear I can still feel it. That cold presence watching from the shadows, waiting for someone else to walk through the door.
Next story.
I used to work at a gas station that was located in the middle of nowhere, right off a desolate stretch of highway. The kind of place where the only sound for miles was the hum of the gas pumps and the occasional rustling of dry leaves caught in the wind. I'd been working the graveyard shift for a few weeks when it happened, the night that changed everything. It was a Tuesday, just after midnight, and the place was unusually quiet. Usually, I'd get a few truckers stopping by for fuel or the occasional late-night traveler, but tonight was different. The night felt still, too still. The air inside the store was thick, almost suffocating, and the lights flickered in a way they never had before. I told myself it was nothing, just a glitch in the wiring, but my gut told me otherwise. I was behind the counter, cleaning the coffee station, when I noticed a car pull up outside. It was an old, beat-up sedan, the kind you see in horror movies before the bad things happen. The headlights blared through the windows as the car rolled to a stop at one of the pumps. The engine cut off, and the sound of the wind outside seemed to intensify. I didn't think much of it at first. People stopped at all hours, but then the driver didn't get out. I watched through the window for a few minutes. The car sat there, idling, its headlights illuminating the empty parking lot. I figured the driver was just taking a break or maybe checking his phone. Still, something felt off. I turned back to my work, trying to ignore the nagging sensation crawling up my spine. But as I wiped down the counter, I heard the door chime. I looked up, expecting to see the driver of the car coming inside for a drink or snacks. Instead, there was a man standing at the door. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, and his face was obscured by the brim of a wide hat. He didn't move at first. He just stood there, staring at me. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to hide the unease in my voice. The man didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward slowly, as if unsure of what to do. There was something strange about his gait. He wasn't stumbling, but his movements were stiff, like he was dragging his feet. His head was tilted down, and he seemed to be staring at the floor. "Excuse me, can I help you with something?" I asked again, this time a little louder, more forcefully. Still no response. That's when I noticed it. His shoes... No, they weren't shoes. They looked like old, worn-out boots, but they were covered in what appeared to be mud or something else. I couldn't tell from this distance, but it was thick, black, and glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. It wasn't the kind of mud I'd seen before. He finally looked up, but what I saw made my stomach drop. His eyes, there was nothing in them. They were completely empty, just dark holes where his eyes should have been. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and there was something wrong with his mouth. His lips were stretched too thin, pulled back in a grotesque, unnatural way that exposed yellowed teeth. I took a step back, trying to process what I was seeing. My pulse quickened, and my breath became shallow. "I'm sorry, but we're closed," I stammered. "You need to leave." The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me with those empty, hollow eyes. His breathing was slow, deliberate, and it was the only sound in the store. Something inside me told me to run. Every instinct screamed at me to get away from him. But I was frozen. My feet wouldn't move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man tilted his head again and took a slow step toward me. That was when I saw it, his boots. They were dragging, leaving behind a trail of something dark, something wet across the floor. I don't know how, but I managed to turn and run. My legs were shaking as I bolted toward the back of the store where the exit was. I heard the man's footsteps behind me, but they were uneven, almost like he was stumbling. I didn't dare look back. I reached the back door and yanked it open, running out into the cold night. I glanced over my shoulder, but saw nothing. The parking lot was empty. The sedan was gone. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were trembling. I thought about going back inside, but the thought of that man, those eyes, kept me rooted in place. I called my manager to report what had happened. He didn't believe me at first, thought maybe I'd just been spooked by the isolation. But I insisted something was wrong. Something wasn't right. The next night, I returned to the station, more out of necessity than choice. I couldn't afford to lose the job. But when I walked in, the air felt wrong. It was cold, colder than usual, and the lights still flickering. I went through my shift without incident until about 3 a.m. That's when I noticed it. On the floor near the counter, there was a patch of wetness. I knelt down to inspect it, my breath catching in my throat. It was the same dark, glistening substance I'd seen on the man's boots the night before. But this wasn't mud. It was thick, almost like tar, and it left an awful, burning scent in the air. I knew then, whatever I had encountered wasn't human. I left the station early that morning feeling nauseous. I haven't returned since. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something's out there, lurking in the dark, waiting. I've heard rumors from other night workers, people who've seen strange things along that stretch of highway. They say that the man, whatever he was, wasn't a person at all, but something else. Something that lingers, watching, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. And now every time I drive past that gas station, I can't help but glance over at it. Even in the dead of night, I swear I can see the faintest outline of a figure standing just inside the door, watching, waiting for the next person to walk into the dark.
Next story.
I'd been working at the old diner on Route 9 for 6 months now. It wasn't exactly a glamorous job, but it paid the bills and gave me the quiet solitude I craved. The diner itself was stuck in the 70s, complete with faded checkered floors, worn booths, and a jukebox that still played scratchy tunes. Most of the customers were regulars, truckers, locals, people just passing through. But the thing about working the graveyard shift was the strange feeling that crept in as the hours wore on. The diner was just too old, too empty, and sometimes it felt like it had memories of its own, memories that it didn't want to forget. The first strange thing happened about a month into my shifts. It was around 2 a.m., a typical dead hour when there were no customers in sight, and the clock seemed to move slower than usual. I was wiping down a table near the back of the diner, the sound of the cloth against the surface the only noise breaking the stillness. Suddenly, I heard the jingle of the front doorbell, the one that always rang when someone entered. I turned around, expecting to see someone walk in, but the door was still shut, and no one was there. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door. It hadn't opened. The bell hadn't even moved, but I could have sworn I heard it. I shook it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I had been working alone for hours and was starting to get tired. I went back to cleaning, trying to ignore the odd feeling that was starting to creep over me. But that's when I heard the footsteps. At first, it was just a light tap, 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 like someone was walking across the diner floor, just out of sight. I stopped in my tracks again. The diner was empty. There was no one else here. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly made my way toward the front of the diner, my shoes clicking against the tiles. Nothing. The floor was as still as ever, no one in sight. I checked behind the counter and then the restrooms. Nothing. Just the usual emptiness. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was in the diner with me. The air felt heavier somehow, like there was a presence in the room that wasn't supposed to be there. I glanced around the diner nervously, but everything looked the same, just the old booths, the jukebox, the countertop. I stood there for a moment longer, listening, but all I could hear was the faint hum of the fridge in the back. Nothing unusual. I was about to turn back when I saw it. A shadow moved across the back wall of the diner, just past the kitchen door. It wasn't like a person walking. It was more like a shape that moved on its own, stretching and shrinking as though it were trying to avoid the light. I couldn't make out its details, but it was unmistakable. I froze. The shadow vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed up by the dim light of the diner. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, certain I had just imagined it, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. My heart started to race, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The diner had always been empty at night. It was supposed to be quiet, but tonight the quiet felt wrong. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my nerves. I decided to step outside for a breath of fresh air, hoping it would calm me down. But just as I reached for the door, I heard it again. A voice. It was so faint at first that I thought I imagined it, but it was there. Someone was whispering. It sounded like a woman's voice, soft, almost pleading. The words were too faint to make out, but the tone was unmistakable, frightened, desperate. I turned back, my heart pounding in my chest. The diner was empty, but the voice was real. It was coming from somewhere inside. I started walking toward the back, towards the kitchen area where the sound seemed to be coming from. And that's when I saw her. At the far end of the diner, near the bathrooms, standing just beyond the shadowy corner of the room, was a figure. It was a woman, pale and dressed in an old-fashioned apron. Her hair was dark, tangled, and her face was obscured, but her presence was unmistakable. The whispering had stopped. In fact, everything had gone dead silent. I stood frozen, unable to move. Her figure didn't seem to move either. She just stood there, watching me. The longer I stared at her, the more I realized something was wrong. Her clothes looked old, like they didn't belong in this time. The diner wasn't that old, at least not enough to explain a ghost. And yet, there she was. Her form was flickering in and out of focus, like a bad television reception. Before I could react, the lights flickered and the temperature in the diner dropped. I could see my breath in front of me. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, silent, watching. Then, without warning, the jukebox turned on. The harsh crackle of static filled the room, and the sound of a woman's voice singing from the speakers echoed through the diner. But the song wasn't one I recognized. It was a mournful tune, low and haunting, like an old blues song, and the woman standing by the bathroom swayed slightly as if in time with the music. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. Everything in the diner seemed to be reacting to her presence. The lights flickered more intensely, and the air was thick with a sense of dread. Then, the voice spoke again, this time, louder, clearer. Help me. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a direct plea, like the woman was begging for something terrible. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what she wanted. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. The jukebox clicked off just as suddenly as it had turned on. The lights flickered one final time and then went out completely, plunging the diner into complete darkness. The temperature plummeted even further, and I could feel the cold against my skin, biting through my clothes. Then, just as quickly as it all started, it stopped. I didn't hear the footsteps anymore. I didn't hear the whispering. The diner was quiet again, but this time, it wasn't the normal, peaceful quiet I was used to. This was something else, something heavy, oppressive. I stumbled to the door, my hands shaking. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see the woman again. The air felt thick, and I could almost feel the weight of her stare on my back as I left. I quit that night. I didn't even finish my shift. I didn't want to know who or what she was or what had happened to her. All I knew was that the diner wasn't just a building, it was a memory, a place trapped in time, holding on to something far darker than any of us could ever understand. And I knew, without a doubt, I would never go back.
Next story.
I started at the old hospital on the outskirts of town just 2 months ago. The pay wasn't great, but it was something. It was night shifts in the records department, filing and sorting old documents. A job most people would consider dull, but honestly, I liked the solitude. The building was massive, practically deserted after hours. Most of the staff had left by 8 p.m., leaving only a handful of us to hold the fort through the night. But then, things started to get strange. It was the second week when I first noticed it. I was working my usual shift, the clock reading just past 2 a.m., when I heard the sound. A soft, muffled thud, like something heavy being dropped. It echoed from the hall just outside the records room. I looked up, startled. The building was silent, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. The air felt thick, and the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. I told myself it was nothing, just the building settling. Old buildings creak and groan at night, right? I returned to my work, trying to focus on the task at hand. But then I heard it again. Thud, thud, thud. Closer this time. My heart skipped a beat. It was coming from the hallway, just outside the records room door. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, and crept cautiously to the door. The hallway was dim, the lights above flickering as I slowly stepped out, peering into the shadows. The long corridor stretched before me, empty except for a few scattered chairs and abandoned carts. Nothing. I sighed with relief. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe a door had slammed somewhere. I couldn't see anything to explain the noise. But then I felt it, a cold draft, sudden and sharp, that sent a chill down my spine. I shivered, my breath catching in the cold air. I looked around, but there was no source for the breeze. No open windows, no fans running, just the eerie emptiness of the hospital, bathed in the dull glow of the overhead lights. I didn't want to go further, but something, some strange force, compelled me to step forward. As I walked, the air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. The feeling of being watched crept over me, and my pulse quickened. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, in front of the old elevator doors, there was a figure. A person, or at least it looked like one. But the moment I saw it, my stomach dropped. This wasn't a normal person. The figure was too still, too rigid. It was tall, dressed in a hospital gown, old, worn, and stained with something I couldn't quite make out. Its face was hidden in shadow, but there was a faint glow, a pale, sickly light around it that made my heart race. It didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. For a moment, I stood frozen, unable to tear my eyes away. Then, it started to move. Slowly, jerkingly, like it was dragging its limbs, not quite functioning the way a person should. It didn't take a step. It just slid toward me, its feet dragging across the floor with an unsettling screech. The air grew colder still, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My legs moved before I even realized it. I turned and ran back toward the records room, my footsteps echoing in the silence as I fumbled to unlock the door. The cold air nipped at my skin, and I felt someone behind me, getting closer. I could hear the dragging sound of its feet on the floor, scraping, relentless. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, leaning against it for support as I tried to catch my breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt like I was going to pass out. For a long while, everything was silent again. I stood there, frozen, listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing. But I knew I couldn't stay in the records room forever. I needed to get out. I had to leave. I grabbed my purse and bolted for the back exit. I reached the stairwell, my legs shaking beneath me, when I heard the unmistakable sound again, the dragging. Thud, thud, thud. Closer now, I turned to look down the hall. There it was again, the figure. This time it was standing halfway down the corridor, watching me. And this time, its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it were studying me, as if it could see me, despite the darkness. I felt its gaze on me, cold, lifeless, and my blood ran cold. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran down the stairwell, through the hospital's main lobby, and out the back door into the parking lot. I didn't stop until I reached my car, hands shaking as I fumbled to unlock the door. I slammed it shut behind me and started the engine, not daring to look back at the darkened windows of the hospital. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it was a ghost, or something else, something worse. But I do know one thing: I couldn't go back. I couldn't set foot in that place again, not after what I'd seen. I quit my job the next day, without hesitation. But even now, I can still feel it, that cold, oppressive presence, the feeling that something is watching me from the shadows. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can hear the dragging of its feet, and I feel that sickly, glowing gaze fixed on me. I don't know if it will ever stop following me.
Next story.
I was working the graveyard shift at a small convenience store out on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet job, the kind where you can just zone out and let the hours pass. The night shift didn't bother me much, except for the occasional strange customer or weird sound that would make my skin crawl. But nothing prepared me for the night I would experience something I couldn't explain, something I could never forget. It was just after 2 a.m. when I saw her. A woman, dressed in a long, old-fashioned gown, entered the store. Her appearance immediately struck me as odd. It wasn't just the strange outfit, there was something off about her, something that made the air around her feel cold. Her pale face was almost ghostly, her hair a tangled mess, and her eyes, those eyes, looked like they had seen too much, like they were lost in time. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to mask my unease with a polite tone. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she walked slowly down the aisle, as if she was looking for something specific. I kept watching her, my mind racing. Maybe she was a traveler, a lost soul passing through. Still, something didn't sit right. She stopped at the back of the store, where we kept the old, dusty magazines, and began flipping through them, her fingers brushing over the pages with unnatural precision. It was odd because we hadn't had a single customer buy a magazine in months. And yet, here she was, almost like she was trying to find something that no one else would care about. I decided to approach her. "Ma'am, can I help you find something?" I asked, a little more insistent this time. She turned to face me, and I took a step back. Her eyes, they were wide open, but it was like she wasn't really seeing me. Her pupils were black, like pools of ink, and her gaze pierced straight through me. "No," she whispered, her voice cold and raspy. "I'm just waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked, barely able to speak. Her lips curled into a faint smile, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Before I could say anything else, she turned away and walked toward the back exit of the store. I stood frozen, not sure if I should follow her or call the police. But then something strange happened. The bell above the door jangled, signaling someone's exit. But when I looked at the door, she wasn't there. It was wide open, and there was no sign of her. I checked the back of the store. Nothing. No sign of a struggle, no strange footprints, not even the faintest trace of her presence. I felt my heart pounding in my chest as I glanced around the store, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was the isolation of working the night shift that was starting to get to me. I shook it off, trying to focus on the clock ticking on the wall. Another hour, and I could go home. But then it happened again. The bell jangled again, and this time it was much louder. I looked up, expecting to see another customer entering the store, but no one was there, just the eerie sound of the bell ringing, echoing in the empty space. I stepped cautiously toward the door, my feet dragging on the linoleum floor. As I reached out to grab the handle, I heard her voice again, but this time it was coming from behind me. Soft, faint, like a whisper in the wind. "Waiting, waiting for you." I spun around, my heart racing, but once again there was no one there. The store was completely empty as it had been when I first started my shift. I couldn't explain it. I was starting to feel dizzy, disoriented. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my coat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys to lock up. But as I reached the door, I froze. There in the reflection of the glass door, I saw her again. The woman. She was standing right behind me, staring at me with those dark, soulless eyes. I turned quickly, but she was gone. I bolted out the door and into the cold night air. The fog had rolled in, thick and heavy, swallowing the streetlights. My breath came in short gasps as I ran to my car, never looking back. I started the engine and drove off, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me, that her presence was lingering just out of sight. I locked the doors, closed the blinds, and crawled into bed trying to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. That night, I dreamed of her. She was standing in the corner of my bedroom, her eyes locked on mine, her lips barely moving as she whispered, "Waiting, waiting for you." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, that she was still waiting. I never returned to that convenience store. I quit the next day, left town, and moved far away, hoping that whatever had followed me would leave me alone. But it didn't. To this day, I hear her voice in the quiet moments, whispering just out of reach, waiting, waiting for you.